He sat there across the kitchen table I'd picked out, the one with the annoying little wobble he never bothered to fix, and told me it was over, just like that, like ordering takeout. Eleanor, he'd said, his voice smooth, practiced, the same tone he used on potential investors. This just isn't working for me anymore. I think it's time we went our separate ways. He leaned back, swirling the last dregs of wine in his glass, a picture of sophisticated detachment. The afternoon sun slanted through the window, catching the gray streaks at his temples, making him look distinguished, thoughtful. Anyone watching would have thought him the epitome of gentle reason. But I saw the flicker in his eyes, the barely concealed impatience, the calculation. He'd already moved on in his head, probably months ago. This conversation was just a formality, a box to tick before he could fully embrace whatever new chapter he'd already written himself into. And he expected tears. Oh, I know he did. Richard always believed emotions were a woman's currency, especially messy, inconvenient ones like sadness or heartbreak. He thought I'd dissolve, plead, maybe throw a plate or two before collapsing into a weeping heap he could step over on his way out the door. He probably had a comforting, condescending speech prepared about how I'd be fine eventually, how strong I was deep down, meaning strong enough to absorb the blow and disappear quietly from his life. He underestimated me. He always underestimated me. He saw the wife, the homemaker, the quiet supporter standing slightly behind him at company parties, nodding politely while he held court. He never truly saw the woman who'd balanced the books for his fledgling company in the early days, working late nights after our children were asleep, deciphering spreadsheets while he was out networking. He forgot who secured that crucial second loan when the bank was about to pull the plug, using my inheritance as collateral, something I'd reminded him of gently, only to be brushed off with a casual, "Oh, right, that. Well, it all worked out, didn't it?" "Yes, Richard, it did, for you." He talked about logistics. The house, the shared accounts, though mostly filled with his earnings, managed meticulously by me. He spoke of fairness, of wanting an amicable split. Amicable. The word felt like sandpaper in my mouth. There was nothing amicable about detonating a 30-year partnership with the casual air of someone changing their dinner plans. He mentioned the business, Sterling Solutions, his pride and joy, the company I'd poured my sweat and sleepless nights into alongside him, albeit without the fancy title or the corner office. "Obviously, the company stays with me," he stated, not asked. "It's my name, my work." He waved a dismissive hand. "But I'll be fair with the settlement, Eleanor. I wouldn't see you struggle. Wouldn't see me struggle." The condescension dripped from every syllable. As if my entire existence, my future security, depended solely on his magnanimity. As if the foundations of that very company weren't partially built on my sacrifices, my quiet contributions, my willingness to handle the unglamorous, essential tasks he found tedious. He didn't see the years I'd spent smoothing things over with difficult clients he'd alienated, drafting proposals he barely glanced at, managing the payroll, the taxes, the endless stream of paperwork that kept the lights on while he chased the next big deal. He just saw himself, the visionary, the deal maker, the engine of success. I was just a leaner, the reliable, predictable backdrop to his brilliant career, and now apparently disposable. I didn't cry, not then. I felt a strange, cold calm settle over me like a layer of ice forming on a deep lake. I nodded, kept my expression neutral, watching him preen, so certain of his narrative, so sure of my reaction. "Okay, Richard," I said, my voice surprisingly steady. "If that's what you want." He looked almost disappointed. Where was the drama, the validation of his decision through my devastation? He finished his wine, stood up, adjusting the cuffs of his expensive shirt. "Good," he said briskly. "I knew you'd be sensible. We can get the lawyers involved next week, sort out the details." He paused at the door, turning back with a final, patronizing smile. "Don't worry, Ellie, you'll land on your feet." Then he left, closing the door softly behind him, leaving me alone in the sun-drenched kitchen with the wobbly table and the ghost of a life I thought was ours. The silence that followed wasn't empty. It was heavy, vibrating with unspoken words, with the sudden jarring realization that the ground beneath my feet had dissolved. But beneath the shock, something else stirred. A flicker, not of tears but of fire. He thought I'd cry. He thought I'd crumble. He had no idea what I was capable of. He'd forgotten who held the details, who knew where the real foundations and the real vulnerabilities of Sterling Solutions truly lay. He'd forgotten about the loan. He'd forgotten about the collateral. He'd forgotten I wasn't just the wife, I was the guarantor. And I wasn't going to land on my feet. I was going to make sure he learned what it felt like to fall. The days immediately following Richard's departure were a blur of forced normalcy. I made the bed, walked the dog, our aging golden retriever, Max, who seemed confused by the sudden absence of Richard's booming voice and heavy footsteps. I answered the phone with a polite, clipped tone when concerned friends called, sensing the tremor beneath the surface but respecting my silence. Outwardly, I was composed, perhaps a little withdrawn, which Richard, on the one occasion he called to discuss preliminary asset division, interpreted as dignified grief. Glad you're handling this maturely, Alina, he'd said, his relief palpable. Makes it easier for everyone. Easier for him, he meant. Easier for him to transition seamlessly into his new life, unburdened by guilt or messy emotional debris. Inside, however, a storm raged. Hurt, sharp and piercing, warred with a cold, simmering anger that grew steadier, more focused with each passing hour. His arrogance, his utter blindness to my contributions, his assumption of my collapse, it all coalesced into a hard knot of resolve in my stomach. He thought I'd be weeping into my pillow, mourning the loss of him, of our life. And yes, there were moments late at night when the silence pressed in and the tears threatened. Tears for the wasted years, for the shared dreams that had turned out to be mine alone, for the comfortable illusion I had mistaken for reality. But the anger was a stronger force. It burned away the self-pity, cauterized the wounds. It demanded action, not tears. It demanded that I stop being the quiet, accommodating Alina he expected and become someone else entirely. Someone who fought back. I started in the place I knew best, the office nook off the kitchen, the one filled with filing cabinets and binders that Richard always referred to vaguely as Alina's paperwork corner. For years, I managed our personal finances and, by extension, a significant portion of the business's administrative side from this cluttered space. Richard hated details. He found bookkeeping tedious, legal documents incomprehensible. You handle it, Ellie, you're so much better at that stuff, he'd say, flashing a charming smile before disappearing to the golf course or a client dinner. And I had handled it, meticulously. I pulled out the thick binder labeled Sterling Solutions Financial. My hands didn't shake. Inside were copies of loan agreements, incorporation documents, shareholder certificates, bank statements going back years. It was all there, a detailed history of the company's financial life, a history I knew intimately because I had curated it. My eyes scanned the pages, initially just trying to grasp the immediate implications for my own security. How much was truly ours? How intertwined were our personal assets with the business liabilities? Then I saw it. The agreement for the second major business loan, the one that had saved Sterling Solutions from bankruptcy nearly 15 years ago. Richard had been desperate. The bank was spooked by his overly optimistic projections and lack of concrete assets. They needed more security. I remember that tense meeting, the condescending loan officer looking down his nose at Richard's increasingly frantic pitches. And then my quiet offer. My inheritance from my grandmother, a portfolio of solid blue-chip stocks left to me solely in my name. I had agreed to pledge it as collateral. Richard had been effusively grateful then, calling me his savior, his rock. He promised me shares, a formal partnership recognition. Promises that faded as success grew, conveniently forgotten, replaced by pats on the head and comments about how I didn't need to worry my pretty little head about business matters. But the paperwork didn't forget. The guarantee agreement was there, signed by me, detailed, legally binding. And then I found the share certificates. While Richard held the majority, a significant block, 20%, had indeed been issued in my name, tucked away in this binder, apparently forgotten by him but not by the official records I maintained. He saw me as the wife he was discarding. He forgot I was also a significant shareholder and the guarantor of the loan that kept his precious company afloat. A slow, dangerous smile touched my lips. He thought this breakup was his decision, his terms. He thought he was shedding dead weight. He had no idea he'd just handed me the knife to cut the ropes holding up his entire world. The paperwork felt heavy in my hands, no longer just records of the past, but tools for the future, my future. Max padded into the nook, resting his head on my knee, his brown eyes full of concern. I stroked his soft fur. It's okay, boy, I murmured, the words tasting different now, truer. It's going to be okay. Maybe not easy, maybe not painless, but okay. Because I wasn't going to cry, I was going to get organized. The next few weeks became a masterclass in quiet determination. I operated under a veil of perceived mourning, playing the part Richard expected. I spoke with him occasionally, keeping the conversations brief, focused on trivialities like dividing furniture or forwarding mail. He remained oblivious, wrapped up in his own narrative of a smooth, guilt-free exit. He even offered, with nauseating magnanimity, to let me stay in the house for a few months to get myself sorted. Take your time, Ellie, he'd said generously. No rush. Oh, there was a rush, Richard, just not the one you imagined. My time was spent not sorting keepsakes but collating evidence. The paperwork corner became my command center. I spread the Sterling Solutions documents across the dining room table, the one he wanted shipped to his new apartment, organizing them chronologically, cross-referencing loan agreements with bank statements, share certificates with minutes from long-forgotten board meetings, which often consisted of just him telling me what he decided. The picture that emerged was clearer, starker, and more damning than I'd initially realized. Richard hadn't just been dismissive, he'd been reckless. Flush with success in recent years, he'd taken out additional lines of credit, leveraged assets, and spent lavishly, both personally and through the business, blurring the lines between the two. Expenses marked client entertainment looked suspiciously like weekend getaways with someone who definitely wasn't a client. Equipment leases were duplicated. There were payments to consultants I'd never heard of. It wasn't outright fraud, perhaps just a pattern of careless arrogance, a belief that the money tap would never run dry, and that someone else, me, would always be there to clean up the mess, balance the books, make sure the foundations were sound even if he was building castles in the air. But the most critical piece remained the collateral agreement tied to my inheritance. Buried in the fine print, a clause I vaguely remembered querying at the time but was assured was standard boilerplate, stated that in the event of significant changes to the company's management structure or foundational agreements, which a divorce and the potential splitting of assets certainly constituted, the lender had the right to reevaluate the loan terms, or the guarantor could potentially withdraw their collateral under specific conditions, triggering an immediate repayment demand. My heart hammered against my ribs as I read it again. This wasn't just about my shares, this was about the bedrock the whole company stood upon. Should I? The initial thrill of discovering this leverage gave way to a wave of nausea. This wasn't just about hurting Richard, this could destroy the company, affect employees, people who had families. But then I pictured Richard's smug face, heard his dismissive words. Obviously, the company stays with me. I wouldn't see you struggle. The anger returned, cold and clarifying. He hadn't worried about the employees when he was spending recklessly. He hadn't considered my security when he decided to toss me aside. He'd made his choices. Now I had to make mine. I needed advice. Not from the family lawyer Richard would inevitably suggest, someone who played golf with him, but someone independent, someone sharp, someone discreet. I remembered Sarah Jenkins, a woman I'd met at a charity luncheon years ago. She ran a small, specialized firm focused on complex financial litigation. She'd struck me then as incredibly intelligent, no nonsense, with eyes that missed nothing. Finding her number took some digging, but I eventually located it in an old address book. Making that call felt like stepping off a cliff. My voice trembled slightly as I explained my situation in broad strokes, emphasizing the need for absolute confidentiality. Sarah listened patiently, asking precise, probing questions. "Everything you have, Mrs. Davenport," she said finally, her tone calm but firm. "All the binders, all the statements, everything related to Sterling Solutions and your joint finances. Let's see what we're really dealing with." The following Tuesday, I packed 2 heavy boxes into my car, Max watching me from the doorway with soulful eyes. Driving to Sarah's understated downtown office, I felt a strange mix of terror and exhilaration. I was no longer just reacting, I was taking control. This wasn't just about surviving the breakup. It was about ensuring my future wasn't dictated by Richard's careless disregard. It was about reclaiming the value I had poured into that company, value he refused to acknowledge. As I walked into the sleek, quiet reception area, clutching the worn handles of the document boxes, I took a deep breath. The quiet, accommodating Alina was fading. Someone else was emerging, someone forged in the fire of betrayal, someone ready to read the fine print and act on it. The game had changed. Richard just didn't know it yet. Sarah Jenkins was exactly as I remembered, sharp, impeccably dressed with an aura of focused intensity. Her office wasn't large or ostentatious but functional, lined with books and discreet file cabinets. She wasted no time on pleasantries after ushering me in. "All right, Alina," she said, gesturing towards the polished conference table where she'd already laid out legal pads and pens. "Let's unpack this." For the next 3 hours, we painstakingly went through the documents I'd brought. Sarah's examination was forensic. She scanned pages with unnerving speed, occasionally stopping to highlight a clause, cross-reference a date, or ask a clarifying question. She listened intently as I filled in the narrative gaps, the verbal promises Richard made, the way business and personal finances blurred, his dismissive attitude towards the paperwork I managed. Unlike Richard, Sarah didn't underestimate me. She treated my knowledge of the company's financial history not as quaint domestic bookkeeping, but as critical intelligence. She saw the patterns I'd seen, the escalating spending, the leveraging of assets, the reliance on that initial loan secured by my collateral. "He became complacent," Sarah observed, tapping a finger on the guarantee agreement. "Successful entrepreneurs often do. They forget the scaffolding that helped them build the tower." She paused, looking directly at me. "This clause you flagged. It's unusual but potentially potent. It hinges on the definition of significant change and the lender's willingness to act, or your right as guarantor under these specific circumstances." She explained the legal nuances, the potential risks and rewards. Invoking the clause related to my collateral was the nuclear option. It would likely force the bank to call in the loan immediately. Given Richard's recent spending habits and the leveraging of other assets, Sarah suspected Sterling Solutions didn't have the liquid capital to cover it. The consequence? Bankruptcy, or at the very least, a forced, messy restructuring where assets would have to be liquidated rapidly. And those assets, Sarah continued, pulling out the share certificates issued in my name, plus any claim you have for your contribution towards the business's initial survival and growth. That puts you in a very strong position if the company is forced to liquidate or sell assets to cover the recalled loan. It wasn't just about getting my collateral back, it was about the potential to claim a significant portion of the company's actual value before it evaporated. Then there were my shares, the 20% Richard had seemingly forgotten about. These are fully vested, properly registered shares, Sarah confirmed after scrutinizing the documents. He can't just ignore them. You are a legal part owner of Sterling Solutions, a liener. Regardless of the loan situation, you have rights attached to these. We discussed strategy. Option 1, use the leverage of the guarantee clause in my shareholding to negotiate a much larger, fairer settlement from Richard privately. Force him to acknowledge my stake and buy me out at a proper valuation, potentially using the threat of triggering the loan recall as a bargaining chip. Option 2, the scorched earth approach. Invoke the guarantee clause, potentially triggering the loan recall, force the issue with the bank, and then use my position as a shareholder and creditor through the collateral to pick through the pieces, effectively extracting my value and potentially more while the company crumbled around Richard. It felt drastic, destructive. Think carefully, Alina, Sarah cautioned, her gaze steady. Option 2 is aggressive. It will likely destroy the company and be incredibly contentious. Option 1 might yield a substantial financial outcome without the same level of devastation, though he will fight you tooth and nail on valuation. I thought about Richard's smugness, his assumption that he held all the cards. I thought about the 30 years I'd dedicated, the sacrifices made, the quiet contributions erased from his version of history. I thought about him telling me he wouldn't see me struggle while planning to leave me with a fraction of what I was owed, emotionally and financially. Fairness. He'd used that word. What was fair? Was it fair that he walk away with the empire I helped build, leaving me with platitudes and a sensible payout? Was it fair that he expected me to simply fade away? No. Fairness, I realized with chilling clarity, was ensuring he understood the true cost of discarding me. It wasn't just about the money anymore. It was about the principle. It was about shattering the illusion he'd built, not just for himself, but for everyone who saw him as the self-made success story. He thinks the business is his lifeboat and I'm the anchor he just cut loose, I said quietly, the words tasting like metal. He needs to understand that I wasn't the anchor. I was the ballast keeping the whole thing upright, and I'm taking my ballast with me. Sarah didn't flinch, she simply nodded slowly. Okay, if that's your decision, we proceed strategically. We need to move quietly and quickly. First step is formally notifying the bank, citing the relevant clauses in your guarantee agreement and the material change in circumstances due to the impending divorce and division of assets. We also need to formally assert your rights as a shareholder. She outlined the process, formal letters, communication protocols, the importance of letting her handle all direct contact with Richard or his lawyers from this point forward. He'll be blindsided, she warned. Expect fireworks. I met her gaze, the fear still present but overshadowed by a resolute calm. Let them come, I said. I'm tired of being sensible. Leaving Sarah's office, the weight of the document boxes felt different. They were no longer symbols of past burdens, but weapons for a future battle. A battle Richard had started, but one I intended to finish. He thought the breakup was the end of the story. He had no idea it was just the beginning of his. The decision made, a strange sense of purpose settled over me. The gnawing anxiety didn't disappear entirely, but it was now channeled into focus, into the meticulous execution of Sarah's strategy. My interactions with Richard became even more carefully managed. I maintained a facade of quiet resignation, agreeing vaguely to his suggestions about mediation for dividing the household items, letting him think the major battleground was going to be over antique lamps and silverware. He seemed relieved, almost smug, likely telling his friends how well I was taking it, how civilized we were being. The irony was a bitter taste in my mouth, but it fueled my resolve. Sarah moved swiftly. Formal letters drafted with surgical precision were dispatched to the bank's legal department and to Sterling Solutions addressed directly to Richard as CEO, with copies sent to the corporate secretary, a role technically held by me for years, another detail Richard overlooked. The letters formally notified them of my intention to exercise my rights under the guarantee agreement due to the irretrievable breakdown of my marriage to the majority shareholder and CEO, constituting a material change in circumstance as defined within the loan covenants. Simultaneously, a separate letter asserted my rights as a 20% shareholder, demanding access to current, detailed financial statements and records, as was my legal entitlement. We anticipated Richard might ignore the shareholder request initially, hoping to stall, but the letter to the bank was designed to trigger an immediate internal review on their end. Banks, as Sarah dryly noted, don't like surprises, especially concerning large loans secured by potentially volatile collateral. The waiting was the hardest part. Every phone call made my heart leap. Every email notification sent a jolt of adrenaline through me. I found myself packing the house, Max trotting faithfully behind me, his tail giving a tentative thump whenever I paused. I tried to distract myself, gardening, reading, attempting complex recipes, but my mind kept replaying conversations with Richard, his casual dismissals, his confident pronouncements about his company. I remembered a specific incident years ago. We'd been celebrating a particularly lucrative contract. Richard was expansive, holding court at a fancy restaurant. I'd made a suggestion about diversifying some of the company's investments, concerned about putting all our eggs in one basket. He'd laughed, patting my hand. "Leave the strategizing to me, sweetheart. You worry about keeping the home fires burning." The memory, once merely irritating, now felt like shards of glass in my gut. He hadn't just dismissed my idea, he'd dismissed me, relegating me to a supporting role in my own life. The home fires. Well, the home fires were about to engulf his precious sterling solutions. About a week after Sarah sent the letters, my phone rang. It was Richard. Not his usual breezy checking-in tone, but clipped tight. "Eleanor, have you spoken to anyone at the bank recently?" Just the question sent a chill down my spine, but I kept my voice level. "The bank? No, Richard, why would I? I just got a strange call from Patricia Carmichael over in commercial loans," he said, irritation coloring his voice. "Something about collateral verification? Sounded like bureaucratic nonsense, but they mentioned your name. Did you change something with your portfolio?" "My portfolio?" I feigned slight confusion. "No, nothing's changed. Why? I don't know," he snapped. "Probably just red tape, but if they call you, just tell them everything's fine, okay? Don't complicate things." "All right, Richard," I said softly. "I won't complicate things." I hung up, my hand trembling slightly. It was starting. The bank was making inquiries. Richard was annoyed but hadn't grasped the significance yet. He still thought it was just paperwork, bureaucracy, something I should handle or smooth over. He hadn't received Sarah's letters yet, or perhaps hadn't processed their implications. A few days later, Sarah called me. "The bank has formally acknowledged receipt of our notification," she said, her voice calm and professional. "They've requested a meeting to discuss the loan covenant implications." Standard procedure, but it confirms they're taking it seriously. Also, Richard Davenport's office signed for the letters yesterday afternoon. Clock's ticking. The pieces were moving into place. My quiet life, the one Richard assumed would continue unchanged except for his absence, was now secretly a hive of strategic activity. While he was likely planning his future, picking out furniture for his new bachelor pad, I was meticulously dismantling the foundations of the business he thought was solely his. There was a dark satisfaction in it, I couldn't deny it. But it was tempered with a heavy dose of fear and a lingering sadness for the life we once shared, the potential that had curdled into this bitter end. He thought I'd be adrift, lost without him. He couldn't imagine that my paperwork corner held the keys to his kingdom, keys he'd handed me himself through years of neglect and condescension. The storm was gathering and Richard was still standing in the sunshine, completely unaware the hurricane was bearing down on him. And it was a hurricane bearing my name. The calm before the storm lasted another 48 hours. Then my phone erupted. It wasn't just Richard, it was his newly appointed lawyer, a slick, aggressive man named Peterson whose reputation preceded him. It was also, surprisingly, my sister-in-law, Carol, Richard's sister, calling in a fluster. Richard had clearly hit the panic button and called in reinforcements. I let Peterson's calls go to voicemail, forwarding the messages to Sarah as we'd agreed. He sounded furious, accusing me of acting in bad faith, of attempting to sabotage Richard during a difficult personal time. Standard bluster. Carol's call, however, I answered. "Eleanor, what on earth is going on?" she demanded, no preamble, her voice shrill. "Richard is beside himself. He said you're trying to ruin his business, something about bank loans, after everything he's done for you. Everything he'd done for me." The phrase hung in the air, thick with implication. I kept my voice deliberately calm. "Carol, this is between Richard and me. It's complicated." "Complicated? It sounds vindictive. He told me you were handling the breakup so well, being so reasonable. Was that all an act? Are you trying to punish him?" "Punish him, perhaps, but it felt more like balancing the scales." "I'm protecting my own interests, Carol," I said evenly. "Things aren't quite as straightforward as Richard might have portrayed them." "Protecting your interests by trying to destroy his livelihood? The company he built?" she scoffed. "That company employs people, Eleanor. Have you thought about that?" Had I? Yes, I had. Late at night, the faces of longtime employees I knew, people like Margaret from accounting or Tom from logistics, swam in my vision. But Richard hadn't thought of them when he risked the company's stability with his spending, or when he decided to discard the person who held critical knowledge and guarantees. "Richard should have thought about that too," I replied, my voice hardening. This situation, it's a consequence of his choices, not just mine. She sputtered for a moment, clearly unprepared for my lack of capitulation, then launched into a defense of her brother, painting him as the victim of a bitter, vengeful soon-to-be ex-wife. I listened patiently, letting her exhaust herself, then quietly ended the call, feeling drained but resolute. They were closing ranks, framing me as the villain. It hurt, but it didn't surprise me. Loyalty, especially in families, often followed the path of least resistance, or the path perceived to hold the most power. They still saw Richard as the powerful one. They hadn't yet understood the shift. Then came the call from Richard himself. He didn't bother with pleasantries. "What the hell have you done, Alina?" he roared, his voice tight with fury and disbelief. "My lawyer just got copies of letters you sent, talking to the bank behind my back. Asserting shareholder rights? Are you insane?" I held the phone slightly away from my ear, letting his rage wash over me. The sophisticated veneer was gone, replaced by raw panic. "I'm asserting my legal rights, Richard," I said, my voice quiet but firm. "The rights you seem to have forgotten I have." "Forgot? This is sabotage. You're trying to leverage this divorce, trying to bleed me dry. I offered you a fair settlement." "Your definition of fair and mine seem to differ significantly," I countered. "And my actions regarding the loan guarantee are entirely within the scope of the agreement I signed, using my assets to save your company years ago. An agreement you benefited from immensely and then conveniently minimized." He was momentarily speechless, probably trying to process the fact that I actually understood the documents he'd always dismissed. This is unbelievable," he stammered. "You were always so reasonable." "Reasonable doesn't mean being a doormat, Richard," I replied, the words tasting like freedom. "I handled the details for years while you took the credit. I secured the foundations while you built the facade. Now that you've decided to end our partnership, I'm simply securing my own foundation." "You'll destroy the company? Is that what you want?" he yelled. "Is this revenge for me leaving?" "This is about ensuring I have the resources I am legally and morally entitled to, resources tied directly to my contributions and the risks I took for Sterling Solutions," I stated clearly. "What happens to the company? Well, that depends on how leveraged you left it, doesn't it? And how you choose to respond now." There was a pause, filled with heavy breathing on his end. He was starting to understand. Not the legality, perhaps, but the reality. The power dynamic he'd taken for granted had irrevocably shifted. "You can't do this, Alina," he said, his voice dropping, laced with a hint of desperation. "We can work this out. We don't need lawyers fighting, banks getting involved. You should have thought of that before you sat me down at the kitchen table and told me it was over," I said softly. "You made your choice, Richard. Now I'm making mine. My lawyer will be in touch with yours." I ended the call before he could respond, my heart pounding. The confrontation was draining, ugly. But hearing the panic in his voice, the dawning realization that he wasn't in control, it was a validation I hadn't known I needed. He'd expected tears, pleas, a quiet surrender. He got cold, hard legal facts. He got the consequences of underestimating the woman who knew where all the bodies and the assets were buried. The fireworks Sarah predicted had begun, and I had no intention of backing down now. The following weeks descended into a tense whirlwind of legal maneuvers and strained communications, all filtered through Sarah and Richard's increasingly agitated lawyer, Peterson. Richard, apparently oscillating between rage and panic, tried various tactics. First, threats. Peterson sent letters filled with legal jargon, accusing me of breaching fiduciary duty, ironic, given Richard's spending habits, and threatening countersuits. Sarah calmly dismantled each claim, pointing to my documented status as guarantor and shareholder, acting within my rights. Then came attempts at emotional manipulation. Another call from Carol, this time tearful, begging me to reconsider for the sake of family harmony and reminding me of all the good years. Even my own son, Michael, called, clearly fed Richard's narrative. "Mom, Dad's really struggling," he said, his voice hesitant. "He says you're making things difficult with the company. Is everything okay?" It stung deeply that my own child would question me, but I understood Richard's influence. "Michael, your father and I are going through a divorce," I explained gently but firmly. "It's complicated and business assets are part of it. I'm doing what I need to do to protect my future. Please trust that." It was a non-answer, but the best I could offer without drawing him further into the ugliness. The core issue remained the bank loan. Sarah had a meeting with Patricia Carmichael and the bank's legal team. As Sarah had predicted, they were deeply concerned. The potential withdrawal of my substantial collateral, combined with the questions Sarah subtly raised about the company's current liquidity based on my shareholder requests for information, which Richard was stonewalling, made them nervous. They formally requested a detailed financial review and a plan from Richard on how Sterling Solutions would manage the debt obligation should my guarantee be withdrawn or the loan potentially recalled. Richard was trapped. He couldn't provide reassuring financials without revealing the extent of his questionable spending and the company's vulnerability. He couldn't afford to call my bluff regarding the collateral, because if I followed through, the company would likely implode. And he couldn't easily fight my shareholder claim for 20% ownership, which significantly diluted his control and potential payout in any scenario. Peterson requested a settlement meeting. Sarah and I met beforehand to strategize. He's feeling the pressure, Sarah said, reviewing the latest correspondence. The bank is breathing down his neck. He needs to make this go away quickly and quietly. He'll try to lowball you, appeal to your history together, maybe even offer you the house free and clear plus a lump sum, hoping you'll drop the claim on the business. The house? I laughed, a short, bitter sound. The house felt tainted now, filled with ghosts of promises broken. He can keep the house. I want what I'm owed from the business. My shares, properly valued, and compensation for the risk tied to my collateral all these years. Valuation will be the sticking point, Sarah warned. He'll present figures minimizing profits and maximizing liabilities. We need our own independent valuation. We hired a forensic accountant, a meticulous man named Mr. Henderson, who began digging into the limited records Richard was forced to provide, cross-referencing them with the historical data I possessed. The settlement meeting took place in Peterson's sterile, imposing office. Richard was there, looking strained, older. He avoided my gaze initially. Peterson did most of the talking, starting with a condescending lecture about the disruption I was causing and the generous offer Richard was prepared to make in recognition of our long marriage. The offer was insulting. A fraction of what even a conservative estimate of my shares was worth, plus alimony that barely covered my living expenses. It was designed to make me feel small, grateful for scraps. I looked across the table at Richard. His eyes finally met mine, and I saw a flicker of the old charm, the manipulative pleading he used so effectively. "Eleanor," he said softly, leaning forward. "Come on, don't do this. Think of everything we built together. Everything we built. The audacity of it, after years of minimizing my role, now invoking shared history to get what he wanted." That was the moment the last vestiges of sentimentality vanished. "What we built, Richard?" I asked, my voice dangerously quiet. "Or what you took credit for while I managed the foundations? I remember discussing diversification. I remember warning you about that risky expansion. I remember securing the loan that saved this company when the bank was ready to walk away. Do you?" The color drained from his face. Peterson shot him a warning look. "My client is prepared to be reasonable," Peterson interjected smoothly. "But Mrs. Davenport needs to understand the potential damage her actions could inflict on innocent employees and the company's reputation. The damage was already being done by unsustainable spending and a lack of transparency, Mr. Peterson," Sarah countered calmly. "My client is merely protecting her legitimate interests. Her shares are not negotiable. The value of those shares, however, is. We require full, transparent access for our accountant to determine a fair market valuation." Richard slammed his hand on the table. "This is extortion." "No, Richard," I said, standing up, my legs surprisingly steady. "This is accounting. Something I handled for you for 30 years. You should appreciate the attention to detail." Sarah gathered her papers. "We await full disclosure for Mr. Henderson's valuation. Until then, our position with the bank regarding the guarantee remains unchanged." We walked out, leaving Richard and his lawyer simmering in the expensive silence of their office. The power dynamic hadn't just shifted, it had inverted. He was no longer the one dictating terms. He was reacting, scrambling, trapped by the very details he'd always disdained. He thought the breakup was his power play. He never imagined the real power lay hidden in plain sight in the binders tucked away in Eleanor's paperwork corner. And I was finally playing my hand. The forensic accountant, Mr. Henderson, was worth every penny. Given access, albeit grudgingly provided by Richard's team, to Sterling Solutions' current books, he unearthed a financial picture even bleaker than I had suspected from my older records. Richard hadn't just been spending lavishly. He'd been borrowing heavily against future contracts, using inflated projections to secure lines of credit, and shuffling money between accounts in a way that obscured the company's true, precarious financial health. There were significant outstanding liabilities, including unpaid taxes and large payments due to suppliers. The company wasn't just vulnerable if my loan guarantee was pulled. It was teetering on the edge already. "He's been robbing Peter to pay Paul for at least 18 months, Mr. Henderson reported grimly to Sarah and me. "The valuation of the company as a going concern is significantly lower than its book value might suggest, due to these hidden debts and unsustainable practices. However," he added, a slight twinkle in his eye, "the liquidation value of certain assets, particularly the intellectual property I helped develop and some key client contracts I brought in and managed relationships for, is still substantial. And your 20% share, Mrs. Davenport, represents a significant claim on those viable assets." This changed the equation. Simply demanding a buyout of my shares based on the company's current shaky status might not yield much. But forcing a situation where assets had to be sold or liquidated to cover debts potentially triggered by the bank calling the loan, put me in a prime position. My claim, bolstered by my status as a key guarantor, could potentially allow me to cherry-pick certain valuable assets or receive a payout from their sale before other creditors, leaving Richard with the shell and the remaining, less desirable obligations. Sarah explained the strategy. We wouldn't push for a buyout anymore. Instead, we would leverage the bank's nervousness and Richard's inability to provide adequate assurance. We would formally move to dissolve my guarantee, giving the bank the justification they needed to demand immediate repayment or restructuring. This would likely force Richard's hand, compelling him to either declare bankruptcy or agree to a structured liquidation overseen by administrators, where my claim would be prioritized. It felt ruthless. Decimating the company I'd helped build, even in its current mismanaged state. But what was the alternative? Walk away with the pittance Richard offered, validating his belief that my contributions were worthless. Allow him to potentially salvage the company later, built on the wreckage of my financial security. No. He'd made his bed of reckless spending and dismissal, now he had to lie in it. Sarah sent the final notification to the bank and Peterson. The response was almost immediate. Peterson requested an urgent final meeting. He knows he's cornered, Sarah told me. He's going to try one last time. This meeting was different. Held in a neutral mediator's office, the atmosphere was thick with tension. Richard looked defeated. The anger was gone, replaced by a weary resignation. Peterson made a brief final plea for a negotiated settlement, offering a slightly higher sum than before, but still far below what my share of the viable assets was worth. Sarah politely declined. My client's position is clear. Given the company's precarious financial state, largely due to mismanagement revealed during due diligence, and the imminent action regarding the loan guarantee, the only viable path forward is a structured dissolution or administration where Mrs. Davenport's claims as both shareholder and guarantor can be properly addressed. Richard slumped in his chair. He looked at me, really looked at me for the first time in months. There was no charm, no anger, just a kind of baffled hurt. "Why a leaner?" he asked, his voice barely a whisper. "Why destroy everything?" I met his gaze, holding it steady. The answer wasn't simple. It wasn't just revenge. It wasn't just about money. It was about reclaiming my narrative, my value, my life. It was about the 30 years of being underestimated, taken for granted. It was about the casual cruelty of his dismissal. It was about ensuring he understood, finally, what he had thrown away. "You destroyed the everything that mattered most, Richard, when you ended our marriage like you were canceling a newspaper subscription," I said, my voice low but clear. "You dismissed my contributions to this company for years. You assumed I would crumble, that I would accept whatever crumbs you offered. You were wrong." I paused, letting the words sink in. This isn't about destroying Sterling Solutions. It's about salvaging my portion of the value I helped create, value you were prepared to deny me. The company's current state? That's on you. The debts, the mismanagement, that's the consequence of your choices. I'm just dealing with the reality you created. Peterson started to object, but Richard waved him into silence. He just kept looking at me, a dawning, horrified understanding in his eyes. He finally saw it. Not the weeping wife, not the quiet supporter, but the woman who held the financial keys, the woman who understood the fine print, the woman whose quiet strength he had fatally misjudged. He opened his mouth, then closed it again. There was nothing left to say. The path was set. Sarah outlined the next steps, appointing administrators, the asset valuation process, the creditor priorities. Richard listened in silence, his face gray. As we left the mediator's office, stepping out into the bright afternoon sun, I felt no triumph, only a profound, aching sadness. It was done. The company, his pride and joy, the entity that had consumed so much of our lives, was effectively finished in its current form. He would be left with the debts, the shell, the public failure. And I would walk away with my capital, my security, my independence. He thought I'd cry. Instead, I had methodically, legally, and irrevocably cashed out his business, leaving him buried under the weight of the liabilities he alone had accrued. It was a bitter victory, but it was mine. The aftermath was messy, but swift. The bank, presented with the final confirmation of my guarantee withdrawal and Mr. Henderson's alarming findings, formally called in the loan. Sterling Solutions, unable to meet the demand, had no choice but to enter administration. The news sent ripples through the local business community. The narrative Richard and his sister had tried to spin of the vengeful ex-wife quickly crumbled as the administrators uncovered the true extent of the financial mismanagement. Suppliers with unpaid invoices came forward. Discrepancies in the books became public knowledge. Richard's reputation, once golden, tarnished overnight. He became a cautionary tale whispered about at the golf club he could no longer afford. I instructed Sarah to ensure the administrators prioritize settling debts with employees first, vacation pay, final salaries. It was the least I could do. Margaret from accounting sent me a brief, unsigned note. Thank you. It meant more than she knew. The process of liquidating assets took several months. Key client contracts were sold off. Valuable equipment was auctioned. The intellectual property I'd helped develop fetched a decent price. As a primary guarantor and significant shareholder, my claim was settled relatively early in the process. The final sum was substantial, enough to secure my future comfortably, enough to start over, perhaps even invest in something new, something entirely my own. It wasn't a windfall born of malice, but the calculated extraction of value I was rightfully owed, value Richard had intended to hoard for himself. Richard, on the other hand, was left with virtually nothing but debt. The administrators pursued him personally for some of the liabilities incurred through blurry corporate spending. His new apartment, the symbol of his fresh start, had to be sold. Carol stopped calling me. My son Michael, however, reached out again. He sounded hesitant, embarrassed. Mom, I heard what really happened with the company finances. Dad, he wasn't honest with me. With anyone, I guess. I'm sorry I doubted you. It's okay, Michael, I said, emotion thickening my voice. It was a difficult time for everyone. We didn't delve deeper, but the bridge between us felt repaired. That mattered more than any business valuation. I sold the house. Standing in the empty rooms, echoing with 30 years of memories, laughter, arguments, children growing up, quiet evenings, Richard's booming pronouncements, I felt a pang of loss but no regret. It wasn't my home anymore. It was a stage for a life that was no longer mine. Max and I moved into a smaller, brighter apartment overlooking a park. It felt lighter, freer. One rainy afternoon, sorting through old boxes, I found a framed photograph from a long-ago company anniversary party. Richard stood center, beaming, arm draped possessively over my shoulder. I stood beside him, smiling politely, my eyes slightly shadowed. Looking at it now, I saw not the happy couple, but the truth hidden in plain sight. His casual ownership, my quiet accommodation. He thought I was merely part of the backdrop to his success. He never realized I was holding the scenery up. I took the photo out of the frame, studied my younger self for a long moment, the woman who believed in his promises, who willingly stepped back into the shadows, who didn't yet know her own strength. Then slowly, deliberately, I tore the photograph in half, separating his image from mine. I kept the half with my younger self, tucking it into a book. A reminder not of what I'd lost, but of how far I'd come. The other half, Richard's beaming face, I dropped into the recycling bin. He expected tears and drama. He expected me to fight over furniture and alimony. He never imagined the real fight would be for the soul of the company he thought defined him. A fight waged not with hysterics, but with spreadsheets, legal clauses, and a deep, unwavering knowledge of the truth he'd ignored. He was left with the debt, the failure, the public consequences of his arrogance. I was left with my future, bought and paid for with the currency of quiet competence he had so foolishly undervalued. Life settled into a new rhythm, quieter, simpler, but undeniably mine. The residual tremors from the Sterling Solutions collapse faded. Richard retreated from public life, grappling with the financial and reputational fallout. I heard snippets through the grapevine. He was living in a small rented flat, trying to find consulting work, a shadow of the confident mogul he once was. There was no satisfaction in hearing it, only a lingering sadness for the potential squandered, the partnership destroyed by ego and neglect. But my focus was forward. The money secured from the administration process wasn't just a safety net, it was seed capital. For years, I'd had a quiet passion for restoring antique furniture, a hobby squeezed into weekend hours. Now, I had the time and the resources. I rented a small workshop space in an up-and-coming arts district. Slowly, meticulously, I began acquiring neglected pieces. A scarred oak dresser, a wobbly Victorian side table, chairs coated in layers of dreary paint. There was a deep satisfaction in stripping away the old, damaged layers, revealing the beautiful wood grain beneath, strengthening the joints, breathing new life into something discarded. It felt symbolic. Max would often accompany me to the workshop, snoozing on a comfortable rug amidst the sawdust and scent of wood polish, a steady, comforting presence. My world became smaller but richer. I reconnected with old friends Richard had subtly edged out, finding camaraderie and laughter I hadn't realized I missed. I took tentative steps towards building a small business around my restoration work, creating an online portfolio, attending local craft fairs. It wasn't about building an empire like Sterling Solutions, it was about craftsmanship, passion, and independence. One afternoon, while negotiating the price of a beautiful but battered writing desk at an estate sale, I bumped into Peterson, Richard's former lawyer. He looked startled to see me, then offered a curt, almost respectful nod. "Mrs. Davenport," he said, his tone neutral. "Good to see you looking well." "Mr. Peterson," I replied calmly. There was a brief, awkward silence. Then unexpectedly he said, "He never saw it coming, Richard. He genuinely believed you just accept things. He underestimated you." "Yes," I said simply, "he did." There was nothing more to say. We both knew the story, the underestimation that had cost Richard everything. As Peterson walked away, I felt a final click of closure. It wasn't about revenge anymore, if it ever truly was. It was about equilibrium. It was about reclaiming the power that comes from knowing your own worth, even when others refuse to see it. Richard had expected me to conform to his narrative of the discarded, weeping wife. He couldn't conceive of a different ending, one where my quiet knowledge and resilience became the instruments of his downfall and my liberation. He thought my strength lay in enduring his decisions. He never realized it lay in my ability to make my own. The bittersweet tang of the whole affair remained. There was sorrow for the shared history, for the what-ifs, for the destruction necessary to achieve freedom. But overlaying it was a profound sense of empowerment. I hadn't just survived, I had rewritten the ending. I had faced the betrayal, the condescension, the attempts at manipulation, and I had emerged not broken but redefined. Standing in my workshop, sanding down the rough edges of the writing desk, preparing it for its new life, I felt a quiet sense of peace. I hadn't cried the way he expected. Instead, I had taken control, cashed out his hollow empire, and left him with the debt of his own making. And in doing so, I had finally irrevocably cashed in on myself. My own resilience, my own worth, my own future. The dust motes danced in the afternoon light filtering through the workshop window. Max sighed contentedly in his sleep. And I smiled, a real smile, feeling the solid strength of the wood beneath my hands. Ready for the next layer. Ready for whatever came next.